Thank you. I want to quote a communications professor at Stanford who said something in 2006 that still applies to today. He said every 5 years, even 5 years later, so he's talking in 2006, visual reminders of the attacks of September 11 can affect attitudes about the causes of terrorism, how to combat it, and George W. Bush. Well, he said this in 2006, but I think it still applies to us today. So let me give you some visual reminders of the terrorist attacks on 9/11. I do this in part because I know most of you were, 3 years old at the time? So you may not remember very well. So let me give you a few images from 9/11. Oh. Okay. Before I give you a list of reasons why the US got attacked on 9/11, I want to give you a small framework of how to think about the causes that brought about the 9/11 attacks. There are a couple of concepts from history and political science that are useful for this, but lots of other things as well. One concept is the idea of proximate and underlying causes of war. Think of proximate causes as immediate causes, something that's sort of short-term. It's a trigger that sets off the event. Okay? And the famous example people always give for a proximate or immediate cause, something that triggered an event, is what happened in Sarajevo in 1914. Okay? And the idea is that World War I, how did it begin? Well, this was the trigger for the war. Now, there are lots of other reasons, but that was the thing that got it started. The opposite of an immediate cause or a proximate cause of something is an underlying cause. And these are usually longer-term sorts of things. All right? So, for example, if we're talking about the Vietnam War, what caused the Vietnam War? Well, one of the underlying causes was fear in the US about communism or the spread of communism. So if we were to apply this idea, the underlying causes, to 9/11, one way of looking at it would be if the attack hadn't happened on September 11th, it probably would have happened at another time because there were the underlying currents that brought this about. They were still there. So maybe if the trigger had been different, it wouldn't have happened on 9/11, but it might have happened a day later, a week later, a month later, or so on. Okay? So you've got proximate causes and underlying causes. Another way of thinking about different causes for something is necessary and sufficient. Okay? So if you take one factor that explains something, it might be necessary, but is it also sufficient? Alone, might that explain something? So another way of thinking about this is, yes, this thing is necessary, but so are other things. For example, I need air to live. okay? But I also need other things to live. So it's necessary. I need air, but I also need other things. So I'll give you an example from the 9/11 attacks. I'll say in a few minutes that one of the causes of the war had to do with, the 9/11 attacks was oil. The dependence of most countries, including the United States, on oil to fuel their economies. Okay? And I would say that's a necessary condition. Okay? But is it sufficient? Is oil the only thing we need to know about to explain 9/11? And the answer is no, we need other things. So oil would be a necessary but not sufficient condition. All right. As I alluded to earlier, you could take these ideas, underlying immediate causes and necessary and sufficient reasons for something, and you could apply it to almost anything. We could apply it, for example, to the attack on Malala. What were the immediate and underlying causes of that attack? You know, by the time you're done with this book, you could probably put together a good list of immediate and underlying causes. What were the necessary and sufficient causes for the attack on Malala? Okay, something you might want to think about on your own or in your sections. All right, with those analytical tools at our disposal, now let me run through I think I have 11 causes of the 9/11 attacks. And they're not in any particular order, I should add. Although I do put the first one first because no one thinks about it. And once they hear about it or they see it, it's like, oh yeah, well, obviously. So the first reason on my list is poor security in the US. Whether we're talking about security at the airports or problems within the security agencies, we had bad security in the US. Okay? And so if we're thinking about causes and how they could have been prevented, well, if we had good security on 9/11, we wouldn't be talking about 9/11. We might be talking about a different date, but if security was good, we could have thwarted that attack. In terms of these security agencies, either the FBI, CIA, every branch of the military has its own security intelligence agency. There were problems in each of these. Like they weren't efficient, in some cases dysfunctional, but they also weren't talking to each other. And this is where you get that phrase, the failure to connect the dots. It's as if the CIA knew some things, and the FBI knew some things, and the State Department knew some things, but they weren't effectively talking to each other, communicating what all the dots were, so nobody had a big picture of what was happening or what was going to happen. All right, so that's my first on the list. The second is totally different, and this has to do with the quality of the terrorist leadership. I'll start on I was going to say positive, but I don't want to say anything positive about terrorist leadership. So I'll just say it's on one level, this was it was a very effective organization, Al-Qaeda, okay? And it was well led from the top. Okay, and at the top was Osama bin Laden, who happened to be a very charismatic figure. Charisma is a certain sort of intangible quality some people have. In his case, he had a very magnetic personality, and he attracted people to him who were willing to take up his cause. Charismatic people are the kind of people like when they walk into a crowded room, people seem to, pay more attention to them for reasons that are kind of hard to describe. And bin Laden kind of had that quality. The number two in Al-Qaeda at the time, Ayman Zawahiri, was not like that. In fact, he may be the opposite of charisma. And when bin Laden was killed, Zawahiri took over, and as far as we know, he's now the number one in Al-Qaeda, but he can't seem to mobilize people as well as bin Laden did. Okay? So that's the sort of effective part of the leadership. To talk about some of the weaknesses of the leadership, I have to talk about the goal of Al-Qaeda. So, ultimately, why was this attack carried out on 9/11? Well, to sum up the goal of Al-Qaeda, it would be something like this. If we, Al-Qaeda, can attack the United States, It will rally Muslims around the world to our cause, and we will then be able to wage a holy war on a global scale against the Judeo-Christian West. And that's the terminology Al-Qaeda was using in the sense that the Jewish and Christians were in cahoots trying to wipe out Islam. Okay. Well, we can assess the quality of the leadership based on this goal. For one thing, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were overly ambitious. Okay. It had to take a really ambitious person to cook up a goal like that and then carry out an attack that would try to unite the Muslims from around the world. But obviously, it didn't happen. And maybe if he hadn't been so ambitious, maybe if he had thought, no, we can't unite all the Muslims around the world, 9/11 wouldn't have happened. Another problem for Al-Qaeda is a concept in the study of war that is prevalent in many different wars, and that is misperception. And one example of this was that Al-Qaeda overestimated its influence. Okay. Yes, it could carry out this attack, but did it have the power to influence people around the world to satisfy that goal? And there was no way this was going to happen. And it hasn't happened. Another part of misperception on Al-Qaeda's part is underestimating U.S. resolve. Okay? So Al-Qaeda, with these huge ambitions, carries out the attack and thinks, all right, the United States might bomb us in Afghanistan a little bit, but they're going to lose interest and go away, and we'll get to do whatever we want to do. But that didn't happen. Okay. Number 3 on my list is somewhat related, but it's a violent and anti-Western ideology. So a third reason the U.S. got attacked is that the attackers had a violent anti-Western ideology. I should probably clarify something that, if it's not obvious to you already, but there is a difference between the religion and the ideology. In your sections, you may want to talk about terminology, because terminology is, you may not realize it, but it's highly politicized. But there's a difference between the religion Islam and the militant ideology that some people refer to as jihadism. I don't, but some people do. So basically, the religion is not the ideology. The ideology can be divorced from the religion. So it may sound like they're doing something for Islam, but they're really doing it for their own sort of personal or political motives. In the book I Am Malala, for example, Malala says that if someone disagrees with your political goals, you get called an infidel. Somewhere in the book, in the first 100 pages somewhere, Malala says that Pakistan's Secret Intelligence Service, the ISI, created the Taliban not to advance Islam, but to help in Pakistan's fight against India. Okay? So again, the religion can be separate from the ideology. Part of this ideology is wrapped up in this vision of going back to the supposedly pure time in Islam at the time of Muhammad. But this is a violent ideology. So how are you going to get life to be like what it was back then? Use force. And you see lots of examples of that, at 9/11 and ever since. Something I'll say a little bit more later, but the primary transmitter of Western ideas that the terrorists see as anti-Islamic, it's the U.S. that is kind of at the center of this. Okay, and hence the U.S. becomes a major target. All right, number 4, oil. And as I describe oil, I have to say more than it's just more about oil fuels economies. There's history in this as well. Most of the countries in the world depend on oil. Now imagine what world politics would be like if there was no oil in the Middle East. Okay? If all that oil that's packed into the Middle East was in South America, by contrast, think of how different life would be. Okay? Maybe Latin American politics would be a lot different than it is today, but the United States wouldn't care so much about what's going on in the Middle East. And let me just give you one sort of extended example of this. We're going to go back to 1990, and this is the beginning of the Persian Gulf War, where Iraq invades Kuwait. I'll give you a map in a second. Iraq invades Kuwait, hoping to take over the oil fields and treasury, everything in Kuwait. And the United States and the United Nations band together to push Iraq out of Kuwait. But a lot of this has to do with oil. So here's Iraq, there's Kuwait down there. Right next door to Iraq is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is one of the world's, has some of the biggest reserves in oil in the world, and it was poorly defended in 1990. So when Saddam Hussein from Iraq goes down and takes Kuwait, the world doesn't know what Saddam's intentions are next. Is he gonna, if he takes Kuwait, is Saudi Arabia next? And the US was worried about this because if Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, a brutal dictator, if he gets a hold of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, he could control roughly 50% of the world's oil, at least back then, okay? And the US and the United Nations didn't want someone like Saddam Hussein being in control of about half of the world's oil. So, as part of that war, the US sends troops to Saudi Arabia to help protect Saudi Arabia just in case Iraq had intentions on Saudi Arabia. Let me bring this back to 9/11. When the US put troops in Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden and others like him saw this as infidels despoiling sacred Islamic lands, because two of the most important cities in Islam are in Saudi Arabia. So they took, the terrorists took this as an affront that the Saudi government has invited the infidels, the Christians and the Jews, to come to Saudi Arabia, and this contributed to the idea that the United States has to be targeted. So if I were to spell it out in words, the sequence kind of goes like this. So a lot of this gets kicked off by Saddam invading Kuwait, okay? But back to my question, what if there's no oil in the Middle East? What if it's all in South America instead? If Saudi Arabia has no oil, then the US doesn't have an interest to go protect Saudi Arabia. In fact, Iraq might not have invaded Kuwait in the first place. Saddam doesn't get mad that they're infidels on sacred Saudi soil. 9/11 doesn't happen. Okay, a fifth reason for the attacks on 9/11. The effects of globalization. I kind of wanted a better title for it, but I guess I'm sticking with this. And the effects of globalization occur on several dimensions. I'll just mention a couple. One has to do with a centuries-long decline in Islam and the corresponding rise of the West. If aliens came to Earth, 1,000 years ago, and they wanted to go to the places on the planet where there was a lot of intellectual activity going on, they probably wouldn't have gone to Western Europe. They probably would have gone to the Islamic world, where advances in philosophy, in astronomy, in mathematics, it was a very dynamic part of the world, the Islamic world. Okay? And then over the next millennium more or less, the influence of the Islamic world declined, and the West, which 1,000 years ago, Western Europe was kind of a backwater, it starts eventually its rise to prominence. And then the emergence of Europe transfers over to the United States and so on. the newspaper The Nation out of Pakistan said that the 9/11 attacks were revenge, even retribution, not just for what had happened in the previous 3 or 4 years, but what had been going on for a very long time. There were the Crusades starting back in, the 11th century. Enlightenment ideas that came out of Western Europe that challenged traditional thinking and religious thinking. Later you get Europeans, now they're stronger, more powerful countries, and they start colonizing many parts of the world, including the Middle East. Again, these are all signs that Islamic influences are on the decline. And ultimately, if we get up to the 1948, the United States and the United Nations create a country that was anathema to the Arabs of the Middle East, and the Persians as well. What country was created in 1948? Israel, right? The only Jewish country the only Jewish country, but it happens to be surrounded by countries pretty much dominated by Islam. So fighting against the US, fighting against the West, can restore the dignity and humiliation that many Muslims felt, and going back for centuries. Okay, another aspect of globalization we should talk about is culture, Western culture. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, but I'll focus on women and the portrayal of women. So in a very simplified way, the terrorist perspective on women is that women should be, by our standards, extremely conservative. I don't even know if we have standards like this, but that this is how women should be attired. In fact, I should not be speaking to a room full of men and women intermixed amongst each other. There are more restrictive, by our standards, ways to dress, like this. Now let me give you some examples of things that would have made the terrorists mad about us. And these are just some random examples I have from American culture. Okay, women should not dress like that in public and not be in Hollywood movies looking like that. Okay, I'll give you another picture. Again, this is like totally random. Okay, it's not random. By the way, Mad Max is up for an Academy Award. I shouldn't say anything about that. Okay. Back in December at some point, I was on the website for the Press Democrat, the newspaper around here. I can't remember what I was looking for, but I saw this image. And the first thing I thought of was FYE. Because I thought this would be a really good example to use an FYE in some capacity. And it turns out I'm using it for this talk because this would also be very inappropriate for the conservative mentality of the terrorists. But it's nothing as bad as something like this. Let me give you a couple other examples. They're not visual, but I think you'll know what I'm talking about. There's this book called Into the Forest. You remember? There are two sisters in that story, right? And they have sex. I don't know what, that's an obvious sign of Western decadence. Okay? But by our standards, and the authors even said this was considered a good thing, that sisters have sex. Seems preposterous, by many standards, but especially by the terrorist standards. The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. You know how that story ends? I know because you read it and you got tested on it. Oscar finally has sex, right? And it happens out of wedlock. And when it happens, or when Junior learns about it, he says, "Praise be to Jesus." Okay? That's not exactly consistent with Christianity, let alone the viewpoint from the terrorists. And instead of condemning the book, what did Western audiences do? They awarded that book the Pulitzer Prize. Okay, let's switch to number 6. And maybe you've been thinking, why haven't we taught about this yet? Well, we're going to talk about it now. US foreign policies in the world. I feel a little guilty only spending a little bit of time on this, but as a group, we only have about 40 minutes. So one of the problems from the terrorists' perspective is the US was actively supporting governments in the Middle East who were oppressive politically. Okay, so Egypt, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. The US decided, well, we don't like those aspects of those countries, but we're going to support them for different reasons. But the terrorists see these Middle Eastern countries as very repressive. They want to overthrow them, and it's hard to because the US is supporting them. In the 1990s, Iraq, let me bring back the Persian Gulf War. The Persian Gulf War started in 1990, right? Iraq invades Kuwait. We go and help with the United Nations kick Iraq out of Kuwait. We protect Saudi Arabia. That started in 1990. After that war was over, Saddam Hussein in Iraq stayed president. And the United States said, look, you've lost this war. We're going to put sanctions on you. We're going to put a stranglehold on your economy unless you do certain things. And some of those things was, tell us definitively what you've got in terms of weapons of mass destruction. Okay. So for the 1990s, the United States and the United Nations have sanctions on Iraq until Iraq tells us definitively what it has in terms of nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons. What does Iraq do? It doesn't tell us the truth. Okay? Or maybe it tells us the truth, but we don't believe it. Okay? But those sanctions stay in place through the 1990s, and they didn't have the effect they were supposed to have, which was put pressure on, the Iraqis would put pressure on the leadership to change their bad behavior. But it didn't happen. The leadership of Iraq stayed in place, but the society suffered. And the terrorists, the 9/11 terrorists, saw this sort of thing and blamed the United States. Now, from our perspective, the sanction would be lifted as soon as Saddam Hussein tells us what it's got in terms of weapons of mass destruction, but it's not telling us. So we blame Saddam for the problem, but the terrorists blamed us. So we become a bigger target. Also, something that angers the terrorists, or angered the terrorists, still do, US support for Israel. The US has, the strongest ally the United States has in the Middle East is Israel. But by and large, Israel is the one country everyone in that region would like to see disappear, or at least be a lot weaker. Related to number 6 is number 7. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. It wasn't what the US was doing in the Middle East, it was what some of those Middle Eastern countries were doing. As I mentioned before, they were politically repressive, but also they were economically troubled. Unemployment in some places was as high as 25%. Depending on the year, sometimes it was even higher than that. I mean, if you are worried about getting a job after graduating from college, imagine not going to college and then trying to get a job. And our unemployment rate is, around 5% now. But imagine if, 1/4 of you, it's probably higher than that because you wouldn't have a college degree. You don't have that many prospects. Okay? So given the political repression, the economic stagnation, the terrorists tried to send out the message that the solution to all of your problems is to follow our version of Islam. All right, now for maybe the most long drawn out example, because we have to go back farther in history to the Soviet era. So number 8? Yeah, number 8 on my list is Soviet policies that ultimately brought about the 9/11 attacks. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Partly it was to help the Afghan communists in Afghanistan so that they could take and retain control of Afghanistan. But the Soviet Union also would have benefited from having a docile neighbor on that border. So the Soviet Union invades in 1979. What does the US do in response? we start helping the anti-Soviet forces in Afghanistan. One of the most important groups we helped were known as the Mujahideen. At the time, back in the 80s, we called them freedom fighters. Well, not all of us, but the government referred to these people as freedom fighters. But it turns out these were people, many of them would go on to become members of Al-Qaeda. Okay? The Mujahideen, the people the US was giving help to, were not liberal Democrats in the broad sense of the term. They were religious extremists. And for a time, they and the United States had the same goal: get the Soviets out of Afghanistan. The war did not go well for the Soviet Union. I've said this before in another context, but I'm glad I came across this picture, because at the time, as the war got worse and worse for the Soviet Union, people were saying, you know, this is just what it was like for the United States in Vietnam. It was a bloody, drawn-out campaign, and there was no end in sight. Now, keep in mind, in the Soviet Union at this time, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union is starting to fall apart. No one really knows it for sure, but the Afghan war is going on in the 1980s when the early signs of decay, well, the later signs of decay are occurring, and by the end of the decade, the Soviet Union is pretty much gone, and in part because of this war. But you had this interesting contrast in worlds, in a way. So here's Ronald Reagan, right here, meeting with members of the Mujahideen and some others in the White House. Okay? Now, I don't know if any of these people later joined Al-Qaeda, but we do know that members of the Mujahideen did join Al-Qaeda and led attacks against the United States. All right, so what happens next? The Soviet Union decides to leave Afghanistan. They've had enough, in a way like the United States had had enough of Vietnam by 1975. Then you get a power vacuum, what's called a power vacuum in Afghanistan. Nobody has taken control of the country. You've got fighting between different tribes, different political organizations, different militia, and ultimately, the Taliban becomes the most powerful group. In assisting them retain control of the country, they ask another organization in to help, Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda ends up using Afghanistan as a staging area and an organizing location to plan the attacks on 9/11. Okay? So conceivably, if the Soviet Union had never invaded Afghanistan, this sequence of events wouldn't have happened, and it's possible 9/11 wouldn't have happened. All right, I'm going to have to move a little faster now. Psychology is another explanation for the 9/11 attacks in lots of different ways, but I only mention a couple of them. Last semester, we talked about identity, okay? And the tools we had for studying identity can be applied to the terrorists. One author that some of you might have read, Fareed Zakaria, who is originally from India, but I think he's an American citizen now. He talks about the fragile identities of the people in the Middle East. Not all of them, but a lot of young men who live in countries with political repression. They don't have many prospects for jobs. And they look for a simpler or pure alternative to what they've got. And militant Islam is often seen as a solution. Malala, in her book, I'll come back to, what's going on here? People who feel like they're low in society join militant groups to achieve status and power. Okay? Another idea from psychology I'll borrow from last semester from You Are Not So Smart, confirmation bias. You think you're open-minded, or maybe you don't, but if you think you're open-minded, maybe you're not so open-minded as you realize. And we can apply that to the militants. Often, the militants end up in what's called an echo chamber, where you believe something, You don't have an open mind. You believe something, you don't look for information that contradicts that, and then you hang out with a bunch of people who think the same way, and you end up in this echo chamber where people are basically saying the same thing to each other, bouncing off the same idea. And one of those ideas is that the United States is the great Satan. Okay? And if you hear more and more people saying this, you believe it more and more. And you get something like this that was not applied to terrorism, but could be applied to it as well. All right, let me move on to number 10. European countries have a role to play here in the 9/11 attacks. They, like the United States, underestimated the threat from Al-Qaeda. Okay? So the United States, we weren't as vigilant as we should have been, but this was also true for the Europeans. An extra problem the Europeans had is that there are quite a few Muslims living in Europe, in different European countries, but they're having a hard time assimilating into those societies. And some feel like they're outcasts in countries either they moved to or were born into. Okay. Some of the planning for 9/11 happened in Europe. Not by what we'd consider traditional Europeans, but by either immigrants or first generation or terrorists who snuck into Europe. Think of this semester with immigration that's happening today. For example, a lot of Syrian migrants are making their way to Europe, and over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, how well will the Europeans treat these Syrian immigrants? Will they get integrated nicely into society, or will they be seen as outsiders? And will that, if they feel like outsiders, are they going to be more prone to do things like what happened on 9/11? My last reason, but there are more, has to do with Israeli policies. And we can go back to the 60s when Israel won some wars against Arab neighbors and took over some territory. Maybe I'll just leave it there. How much time do you want to have for Q&A? Okay. Let me throw out one other idea to finish. But I want to put up this image first. Not this. Oh, sorry. Well, I guess I'll talk about this. The SWAT region up here is where Malala is from. But it's part of a broader Pashtun area, an ethnic group in the area that is in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. The United States is still going after terrorists ever since 9/11, but some of them are in this part of Pakistan. Now, we're not at war against Pakistan, but we carry out attacks there because the terrorists hang out there. Okay, hang out, that's not a good word. But, and what the United States has done over time is that we've shifted a little bit from bombing with manned bombers to drones. Okay? And the US actually has a pretty good track record of hitting targets, but it's not a perfect record, and we sometimes kill civilians. And the terrorists use that for propaganda purposes to blame the United States for all these terrible things that are happening, well, anywhere, but in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. And this ties into the propaganda of the Taliban in Pakistan that you'll see in the book, I Am Malala. Now, there are more reasons. This I will try to finish with. There's some people say that we got attacked on 9/11 because of who we are and what we stand for. Okay? And I remember many in the government at the time, US government, saying we got attacked for who we are and what we stand for. But there's a different view. And I'm more a subscriber to that view. We didn't get attacked for what we are and what we stand for, but what we've done. Okay? So if you look at a bunch of countries around the world, they more or less stand for what we stand for, but we're the ones who had this massive attack. Now, there are some other countries that have suffered attacks as well, but you don't see Australia being the target by Al-Qaeda. Okay? So it's more than just what we stand for, it's what we do. Some people say it's what we stand for, and therefore it's our fault that we got attacked. Jerry Falwell said that the United States got attacked essentially because we allow abortionists, feminists, homosexuals, the ACLU, and pagans. Okay? Why did we get attacked? It's not what we did, it's what we stand for. And he's saying we don't stand for the right things. We are not Christian enough. That should lead to some interesting conversations. This mentality you will find in the book, I Am Malala. She wrote, for example, on page 107, that some religious leaders in Pakistan said that the great earthquake in 2005 was a warning from God. It was caused by women's freedom and obscenity. If women didn't mend their ways and introduce Sharia or Islamic law, more severe punishment would follow. So basically, if you're not religious enough, bad things happen. Now, one reason I don't buy this argument is that if we had been a more Christian country, Al-Qaeda probably would have hated us even more. Okay? Let me leave you with some questions to consider. Not this. So tying into the start of my conversation here, what are the immediate and underlying causes of war? How can we address the underlying causes of terrorism? And what would Malala say? Concepts from last semester, agency and structure. How can we take those ideas and apply them to the causes of the 9/11 attacks? Is a clash between Islam and the West inevitable? What would Malala say? What other factors might have been relevant for the attacks of 9/11? If there's interest, we can talk more about this at the round table. And finally, a question for you and your future. How long are we going to have to face those kinds of threats? Okay?
So this is a two-part question. How are Al-Qaeda and ISIS different? Also, how was the vacuum created for ISIS?
Okay, how are they different? I remember when ISIS, which it refers to the Islamic State, the name, by the way, is, no one's really settled on what the name is. Some people call it ISIL because it was actually originally the Islamic State in the Levant and then Syria. Some people just call it the IS, Islamic State. But I remember when it started to become more prominent, hearing that they were partly with Al-Qaeda at the beginning and then became an offshoot in their own entity. And Al-Qaeda said, those people are too crazy for us. Which says a lot if you're in Al-Qaeda, okay? These people differ in the severity of their attacks, which also says something about Al-Qaeda. The goals are very similar, that they want to take over the supposedly un-Islamic governments of the Middle East, just like Al-Qaeda, so in that respect they're the same. How else are they different? Their propaganda is world-class. They get messages out through social media, YouTube, Facebook, you name it. They are excellent at getting their message out, much more so than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda seems like a dinosaur by comparison. But I would say their goals are similar, with one exception. It's hard to say that Al-Qaeda is this monolithic single entity. Same thing with the Islamic State, that it's this cohesive unit that all does something in unison. Because there are different factions within Al-Qaeda, just like there are different factions in the Islamic State. So some Islamic State organizations only care about what's going on in their country. Others care about, and they only want to carry out terrorist attacks in their country. Others want to go global and say attack the United States. What was the second part of the question?
How was the vacuum created for ISIS?
by the ineffectiveness of Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's the short answer to the question. The US and countries in the region started putting the clamps down on Al-Qaeda. You know, we tracked down bin Laden. And when he was out of the picture, his skills, his charisma could not be used for the cause, and Al-Qaeda seemed to wallow for a while, and this helped ISIS come into being.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.